ships beginning to crack apart. For no obvious reason. Not after being hit by enemy fire, and not after sailing through a massive storm. How could steel suddenly behave so fragile? Something like glass. It usually bent before it broke. So why didn't these ships bend? Why did they directly break? With thousands of rivets, in these ships, many sections were welded together. It's not enough to ask how much load a material can carry. You also have to ask.
Hello everyone, this is Ruhi here and welcome to Cross Section. So the idea behind this channel is that every object around us has a story hidden beneath its surface. And most of the time, guess what? We never notice it. But seriously, every crack, every failure, and even every breakthrough has a reason waiting to just be discovered. So at cross section, we go beneath the surface, not just to understand what happened, but to uncover why it happened. Because every failure leaves behind a lesson, and every story has another layer waiting to be revealed. So let's get started.
Imagine building one of the largest fleets in history. Thousands of ships, millions of tons of cargo, food, fuel, weapons, everything needed to help win a world war. Now imagine those ships beginning to crack apart. For no obvious reason. Not after being hit by enemy fire, and not after sailing through a massive storm. In fact, when observed, some ships seem to have fractured while sitting quietly in harbor. No collision, no explosion, no enemy attack, just steel breaking apart. These were the Liberty ships of World War II, and they forced engineers to question something they thought they understood. How could steel suddenly behave so fragile? Something like glass. Let's investigate. First, nobody thought much of it. Large ships occasionally develop cracks. That wasn't unusual. But then, after the first ship, another one cracked, and then another. And soon, dozens of ships were reporting similar failures. The cracks became longer. Some stretched across the entire deck, others reached deep into the hull. And a few ships fractured so severely that they almost completely split in half. Engineers soon realized they weren't investigating one accident anymore. They were investigating an entire fleet, and naturally, several theories emerged. The chief among them were: had the ships been built too quickly? Were the welds poorly made? Was the steel defective? Were the ships overloaded? Or had the freezing ocean somehow weakened the structure? One by one, investigators ruled these explanations out as the sole cause. The answer turned out to be something far more surprising. The steel itself was behaving differently than anyone had expected. To understand why, we first need to understand why steel had earned such an extraordinary reputation. By the 1940s, steel had already built the modern world: bridges, railways, factories, skyscrapers, and ships. It was, in fact, one of the strongest and most trusted engineering materials ever developed. If there was one material engineers believed they understood, it was steel. Steel had another quality that made it especially valuable. When pushed too hard, it usually bent before it broke, and that gave engineers time to notice damage before complete failure occurred. So, why didn't these ships bend? Why did they directly break? Well, the Liberty ships were built differently from many older ships. Instead of joining steel plates with thousands of rivets, in these ships, many sections were welded together. This allowed shipyards to build vessels faster than ever before, exactly what the war effort desperately needed. The decision wasn't wrong. In fact, it was one of the greatest manufacturing achievements of the war. But it also reveals something engineers had never fully appreciated. Most Liberty ships spend their lives crossing the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. And that's where the material story truly begins. Most people assume that a material behaves the same way whenever it's used and wherever it's used. But some materials have a hidden personality that only appears under certain conditions. And steel is one of them. Imagine taking a chocolate bar from your kitchen. It bends slightly before breaking, if it's like left outside. Now leave the same chocolate bar in the freezer, and instead of bending, snap. It just snaps. Steel isn't chocolate, and the science is different. But in this case, some of the steels displayed a surprisingly similar change in behavior. When engineers describe a material as ductile, which in this case steel was, they simply mean it can bend or stretch before it breaks. Think of bending something like a paperclip. It changes shape first, giving a warning that it's close to failure. A brittle material, on the other hand, behaves very differently. It doesn't bend much at all. Once a crack starts, it can suddenly snap without much warning, just like glass. And at normal temperatures, structural steel, which was used in these ships, is usually ductile. But in freezing conditions, some steels become much more brittle. And instead of bending to absorb the load, they become much more likely to crack. Wait, what? This is what the engineers call the ductile to brittle transition. Let's try to understand it further. Now, imagine a tiny crack forming somewhere in the ship's hull. Normally, a ductile steel can deform slightly around the crack. We discussed that ductile materials are those that can bend, so they deform slightly. This is getting a little technical now, but hear me out. That spreads the force over a larger area, making it difficult for the crack to grow. But in freezing conditions, the now brittle steel couldn't absorb the stress as effectively because it was not able to deform. Instead, the force became concentrated at the tip of the crack. Very simple. If you have a crack and the material around the crack is able to adjust, let's say, its shape or bend slightly, it is able to absorb force much more effectively than something that is rigid. And in this case, because the material was so rigid, the crack grew. Then it grew even faster, and eventually it raced through the hull. The steel hadn't suddenly become weaker, it had simply become much easier for a crack to spread through it. Welded construction added another piece to the puzzle. Imagine tearing a sheet of paper. Now place small strips of tape across the tear for every few centimeters, and each strip makes it harder for the tear to continue. Older riveted ships unintentionally worked in a similar way. The riveted joints often interrupted the growing cracks, but the welded hull in this case created a much more continuous path, allowing cracks to travel much farther once they had started. This, however, didn't mean that welding was a mistake. It simply showed that weld design, material behavior, and crack resistance all had to be considered together. The Liberty ships completely changed engineering. Before this, engineers mainly asked one question: how strong is the material? The Liberty ships taught them that this wasn't enough, because a material can be incredibly strong and still fail catastrophically. Think about dropping a glass ball and a rubber ball. The glass ball is actually very strong, but once it cracks, it shatters. The rubber ball isn't nearly as strong, yet it survives the impact because it can absorb the energy without breaking. That's the difference between strength and toughness. Strength tells us how much force a material can withstand, and toughness tells us how much it can resist cracking and breaking once the damage begins. The Liberty ships taught engineers that both are equally important, and that single realization gave birth to much of modern fracture mechanics. Today, it influences the design of ships, aircrafts, bridges, pipelines, pressure vessels, offshore platforms, and even spacecraft. So, what was the lesson here? The lesson wasn't that steel is a poor engineering material. Steel remains one of the most important materials ever developed. The real lesson was that engineers hadn't discovered a weak material. They had discovered that strength and toughness are not the same thing. The same steel that bent safely on a warm day could fracture without warning in freezing conditions. Because in engineering, it's not enough to ask how much load a material can carry. You also have to ask what happens when the material is damaged. And sometimes, understanding how a material fails is just as important as understanding how strong it is. And that brings us to the end of this story. Was there something about the story that maybe surprised you? Or is there another engineering mystery you've always wanted to know about? Whatever it is, I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section below. And remember, if you're someone who loves to understand or is trying to figure out the hidden science behind engineering, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next episode of Cross Section. Looking forward to seeing you then.